Welcome back to Presidents and Politics. It's exciting to have a brand new season.
Yes, it is.
I am Professor McGee, joined by my co-host, former Congressman Ross, and we find ourselves talking on a very interesting human being and president this podcast.
And exciting. You know, if you want to look at today's polarization and the divisiveness between parties and candidates, you know, it's really nothing new. Let's go back to Andrew Jackson, who probably, you know, set the stage for the modern presidency with his behavior and his determination and his independence. What a fascinating person and president.
As you said, party politics really played into this a lot. And
Yes.
I remember reading through a lot of the slogans, and man, there was just such mudslinging going on. And one of the slogans was, vote for Jackson who can fight, not Adams who can write. And you really see this, right? Like Jackson, he is the ideal blue-collar Tennessee, brought up by the bootstraps of his own work.
He was born into poverty. His mother and his brother were killed in the Revolutionary War. He was held prisoner.
Yes, only president who has ever been held prisoner of war, and the last president who fought in the American Revolution. He was 13 at the time. It's kind of hard to say that he fought, but he did sustain some wounds, actually.
Yes, as a boy.
Yes, crazy officer raised a sword, cut him across the face and the hand, and was marched 2 weeks to a British war camp before later being released.
He hated the British.
He did. He always said he carried a scar of his hatred of the British with him.
Yes, he did.
For the rest of his life.
Yep.
And he hated a lot of things.
He was not shy to express his opinion, but he was a determined man. I mean, you look at this guy, born into poverty. You know, his mother and his brother die.
And fatherless. His father dies even before this.
And
so he's orphaned.
Orphaned, self-taught. You know, determined to become a lawyer. Becomes a lawyer. Moves to Nashville. And suddenly establishes the most amazing practice and representing, you know, collectors. He was doing collections, and he endeared himself to landowners and wealthy people who then found him to be, you know, a great person of support, and that just built his career. And politically, you know, he was one of the ones that wrote the Constitution for the state of Tennessee.
That is correct.
And then he was the first one appointed to the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives.
And he talked about when he came to Washington that he thought that his opponents expected him to show up as a savage with a tomahawk in one hand and a knife in the other.
Wow.
He was backwoods. And I think he caught a lot of flack for this. A lot of the elites.
He served less than a year.
Exactly. The blue bloods of New York and Boston, all these areas, when they looked at him, they looked down upon him. And I think in some ways he kind of carried that chip on his shoulder.
Oh, I think he had a chip on his shoulder all throughout his life. And you know, he comes back from Congress with less than a year, says that Washington is not for me. I'm never going to do it again. And by the end of the year, he's appointed to the U.S. Senate.
Yes.
Where he serves less than a year.
Yes.
Says, I am not doing this stuff.
Yes.
And, you know, this ain't me.
He's known primarily before his presidency for his military career. And what a military career he had.
And you know what's interesting, because he starts his military career by enlisting his own militia. He's not
Which is disbanded, but he doesn't listen.
Right.
And marches his militia anyway because he always had a problem with authority.
He had a serious problem with authority. He raises a militia of 50,000 men ready to go into Canada, and finally, when the U.S. recognizes him, and they put him in at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend down in Alabama.
That's correct.
Where he overcame the Creek Indians. He and Indians did not have a good history.
That is the elephant in the room, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is when we talk about the presidency of Andrew Jackson, it is very marred. And here's one thing that I always talk to my students about. There's a difference between goodness and greatness. And I think that a lot of times in our new English, we do a disservice because greatness is a superlative of goodness. So if chicken tacos are good, then steak tacos are great. That's not how it worked in the Old English. So goodness was purity, it was ethics, it was morality. Jackson wasn't a good man. Greatness is power and majesty and the ability to command. Jackson was a great man. And I think sometimes when we look at history, there is this new modern idea of erasing great men in history, but we still need to study great men. I know a lot of times we know, let's erase Columbus, let's erase the conquistadors, let's erase these men in history. They weren't good men, but they were great men. And I think history still, we don't read over great men because they were not good, because I think we can learn from their greatness and then hopefully add our morals and ethics to that. And then, of course, as a Christian college, we add the Holy Spirit to that, and that makes things different. But I don't think we need to strike men from the pages of history because they weren't good. I think the fact they were great still deserves mention and study. I mean, think about the Roman emperors.
Oh, yeah.
Think about the Alexander the Great. Was he a good man? Shoot, no. But he was a great man.
Yes.
And Andrew Jackson wasn't really a good man per se, but he was a great man. Now, he's a quandary when it comes to the Native Americans.
Oh, it was in fact, he turned a blind eye to it when he was president
Yes.
in the state of Georgia. But he was also an anomaly. I mean, he was a states' rights person, but yet he when South Carolina tries to do this nullification, which we'll talk about probably in a few minutes, he gets ready to ask Congress to get a militia to go down there and stop that. And he became president after he lost the first time in 1824 to John Quincy Adams because nobody got a clear victory, and so it went to the House of Representatives. And he has the most votes, but not enough, not a majority. And then Adams cuts a deal with the Speaker of the House, Clay, and Adams gets elected. And
this corrupt bargain.
The corrupt bargain,
Yes.
but he never forgets it. In fact, he starts to prophesize that we're going to get rid of the Electoral College.
That's right.
That's nothing new either, guys.
Oh, right.
The Electoral College has been a debatable issue since its creation.
Yes.
And will continue to be so.
Yes.
And, it was because he had the popular vote, he had the most electoral votes, but he didn't become president because he didn't have a majority. And I can see his disdain, I can see his frustration, I can see his vengeance.
Yes.
And 4 years later, by golly, he turns it around in 1828 and becomes president.
The Electoral College is one of those things where you see the problems behind it, but can you imagine what the U.S. would be like without it? I mean, think about the fact, and it's been said, and I think there's some truth to this, you don't really have a lot of blue states, you have blue cities.
Yes.
And can you imagine a state like Wyoming? What does Wyoming have, 500,000 people in it?
Yes, if that.
If that, right?
3 electoral votes.
Yeah, so imagine like the actual power and authority that state would carry versus New York City, versus L.A., versus Santa Barbara. I mean, they're going to completely be drowned out. So that's the reason why we have the Electoral College. I hear all the time students be like, well, we just need a popular vote. You're going to have like 5 cities. They're going to elect every individual that comes into power.
Yep. And all the small ones will have no attention or, they will be ignored.
Yes. Yes. And I think this is some of the problem already happening because Andrew Jackson, he's from the backwoods of Tennessee. And the problem is he's prophesying that something would actually hurt him in the long run.
True.
I mean, Tennessee doesn't have that large of a population either, but what he sees is he had the popular vote. So he's like, if we just had the popular vote, I would have won. So I think there's personal reasons why he wants that Electoral College pushed away.
Yep.
Going back to his relationship with the Native Americans, one interesting thing is as you study a little deeper in his life is that he actually he slaughters, he massacres, he goes through all of this. Of course, he demolishes the Creek Indians. He'll come down to Florida in the First Seminole War and the Panhandle.
On his own initiative. That
slaughtering.
So he goes down there, he pushes them back, and he gets a lot of pushback from Congress.
Yes.
In fact, it was John Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State, came to his defense and saying this is what we needed, which then expedited the acquisition of Florida to the United States.
That's right. And in the process, Jackson ticks off basically all of Spain and all of Britain. I mean, just completely just alienates America even more, drives us more to isolationism at the time. But during some of these campaigns, he actually comes across an orphaned Creek Indian baby. And he adopts it. Yep. And he names him Lincoa, and it's my Okeechobee accent. Who knows if that's actually the correct pronunciation? But he actually raises him as his own. He gives him a good education, and his desire is to send Lincona to West Point and actually have him become a military officer in the American military and rise up through the ranks. And of course, Lincona dies at I think the age of 16, so it never takes place. But he is such a quandary. I mean, here is Jackson, and he's slaughtering Native Americans on one corner, and then he's adopting Native American babies and raising them as his own on the other, and it's just he's an enigma.
He is very much an enigma, and he was also a slaveholder.
Yes, he was.
And in fact, built his hermitage, and on slaves, and was a proponent of slavery.
Yes.
And the westward expansion.
Yes.
It's how do you what would it have been like without him? What would it have been like without him? Who knows? But
he was the catalyst that led to westward expansion.
Yes. He was the first president from the west of the Appalachians. So, and he was so unconventional in the way he did it. He was elected. He was a populist president.
Yes, he was.
One
of the first, probably.
Probably the first.
I mean, Washington in some ways, but Washington's kind of his own thing.
Yeah.
I mean, who can? He's also the last president who will hold 2 terms until Lincoln, actually. No other president until Lincoln
That's
will
true.
hold 2 terms because again, and I think he's probably part of this, that policy, that just very
partisan.
divided politics that comes
Yeah.
up. He is part of that, and it just makes the country take several decades to kind of heal from that, which is kind of where we are today, right?
Oh, yes.
We're back at that point.
And then speaking of where we are today, the viciousness of campaigning, they attacked him and his wife, saying that he was an adulterer because Rachel, his wife,
The divorce had been finalized,
Yep.
and the issues with 1800s court, yes.
yes, and after he was elected in 1828,
That's correct.
before he takes office, she dies. And that's just and he felt that the negative campaigning was so stressful on her that it was the reason for her demise.
Yes, and he'll actually duel for her honor before he goes
He
into
dueled
office.
12 times
Yes.
and actually killed a person.
Yes, and carried 2 bullets. One
Yes.
set next to his heart. I mean, here he is in the office, and he's sitting with like multiple lead. I mean, is Tupac in office or is Andrew Jackson? This guy's sitting here like multiple lead in his chest.
You wonder if he was ever a poker player because the guy, you'd have to take him seriously.
Oh.
If he said he was going to do something, by golly, most likely he was going to do it.
He's going to do it.
It was, and again, getting back to the Indian situation, what happened with the Cherokee Indians in Georgia,
The Indian Removal Act and the
the
Trail of
Indian
Tears.
Removal Act,
Yes.
and how we forced that, and it was such a black mark
Yes.
on our country.
Yes.
And you can't justify that human misery
No.
under any circumstance.
No, and I'm glad you brought that up.
But it still makes you just say, wow, what an enigma this man
Yes.
was as president. And, I think he really accentuated the independence of the executive office.
That's good.
More so than anybody of his predecessors and probably anybody since, recent time. But he was determined to do it his way.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
When it came to the national bank.
Yeah.
That he felt was just, benefiting the few at the expense of the many.
Mm-hmm.
And Dan Webster and Henry Clay were supporting it, and they were going after him. And when the bill passed, he vetoed it,
Mm-hmm.
and they were coming after him again. But by golly, he was going to let them know, this bank ain't coming back.
No.
And he
Come
made
hell or
sure
high
that,
water.
Yeah. Diplomacy was not his wheelhouse.
I don't know if the word was in his vocabulary.
Doubtful that it ever was.
Honestly. Going back to the Native Americans, I like where you brought this up because, like you said, there's no way to ever justify this. Sometimes, as American historical scholars, we're like, well, you got to understand. There is no understanding that. There was, and one of the things I love studying the Seminole Indian Wars of Florida, and one of the things I always walk away with when I study the Seminole Indian Wars is an immense respect for the Seminole Indians because they were warriors.
Yes.
They were always outnumbered, they were always outgunned, and they fought
And they weren't moving.
ferociously.
They weren't moving.
No, and one of the things I think about is I remember interviewing an older veteran one time, he's from World War II, and he made this statement. He said, "You fight for where you're born."
Wow.
And that's so profound. And I thought about Andrew Jackson, and he was fighting on one side. And you think about like Osceola and Alligator Jumper and all these like famous Native Americans fighting on one side. And they fought where they fought because many times they were born there. Had Andrew Jackson been born a Creek Indian, he would have probably been a famous chief who was fighting on the Creek Indian side, right?
You're right.
Had Sitting Bull been born in Boston, he probably would have been the next president, like
right.
with Teddy Roosevelt. Like a lot of times you fight for who you fight because you were born where you were born.
Wow. Robert E. Lee.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
And I just think there's a lot of understanding that comes to that if you really start thinking that through. Now there are exceptions to that. I mean, things like the Nazi army,
Yes.
things like terrorists of 9/11, like there are some things that are just inexcusable, period. But I think it's very interesting that a lot of times you fight where you fight because you're born. And the other thing I thought with Andrew Jackson is to be a healthy human being and kill another human being, one thing that takes place is you dehumanize.
Yes.
You make that group of individuals feel like they're less than human. And I think that Andrew Jackson had done that for so long in war. If it was the War of 1812, if it's the Seminole Indian Wars, the Battle of New Orleans, the Battle of Pensacola, he's killed Native Americans for so long, he's dehumanized them so that when he comes to office as president, I don't know if he can still even see them as a human yet and still be a sane individual because he'd have to deal with all of this blood that he shed throughout his life. And I think that kind of marred him and marred the policies that he made.
Yeah. It helped justify his continued actions.
Yes.
And speaking of the Battle of New Orleans, that was what really catapulted him as a military hero.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wrote some of the numbers down. I'm trying to find it. It was amazing, the results. So what was it? The U.S. had 5,700. The British only had 8,000. We only had 13 dead. They had 291 dead.
Wow.
39 wounded on our side, 1,200 wounded on their side. The military tactics of Jackson's mind were brilliant. He's not a very learned man. He's not an Adams who's speaking Latin and Hebrew
no,
and Greek.
no,
in the least.
no.
Well, what was his really famous statement? What was it? It's not, excuse the profanity, but this is his exact quote. It's a damn poor man who can't spell a word 3 different ways. I think that was one of his famous quotes. I mean, this is the mind of Jackson, but tactician-wise, military-wise, brilliant.
Brilliant. When the Battle of New Orleans is over, nobody knew that the War of 1812 had already been resolved with the Treaty of Ghent. But the word gets back that he did this. And you have to understand, the War of 1812 was demoralizing to the United States.
Very much, especially on the Canadian front.
Yes. And the British had taken over Washington. They had burned the Capitol. They had burned the White House. And the only bright spot was what happened with Andrew Jackson down in
down in the swamps of Florida.
Yes, and that really catapulted him into national prominence, not only as a leader but also as a military strategist, which was amazing.
It's also he picks up his nickname Hickory because he was inflexible, and then as he starts aging, they start calling him Old Hickory. And I remember reading a political scientist on this, and he said typically presidents with nicknames do better in the polls with common men. And this was probably one of the things that helped him. He was Old Hickory. You think about Teddy Roosevelt, the Bull Moose.
Yep.
You think about like different presidents who really appealed to the common masses, and they had very catchy.
I like Ike.
I like Ike, right?
Yeah.
You think these very like catchy nicknames, and we don't see that as much anymore.
No, we don't.
You wonder if that would be a smart campaigning strategy for the future, is to go back to this common man nickname idea.
That's a good point.
We just helped some campaign somewhere, maybe, I don't know. But that's an interesting thought that's not used a lot anymore. But it was very popular. It made him, in many ways, who he was.
Well, what I think is fascinating to show you how determined this man was is that he was the subject of an assassin.
Oh, I love this.
And the gun misfires, so he pulls out another gun and then misfires again, and then Andrew Jackson just continues to just pummel this guy
with his cane.
Beat him up with his cane.
He's limping because he's carrying lead in him. He's had smallpox. He's been battered.
You do not intimidate Andrew Jackson.
He's 6'1". I think they say he's about 140 pounds this time. So he's a beanpole walking with a cane. This guy comes, I think it was in like 2.5 yards. They say pulls one, misfires, pulls a second from his coat pocket. And Jackson runs towards him and takes the cane and just beats the mess out. And the legend says, I don't know if it's true or not, I've yet been able to confirm this, that actually Davy Crockett is
that's what I heard too.
Yes, Davy Crockett is the representative that pulls him off. He's probably one of the few guys that could pull him off.
Yeah.
That Davy Crockett actually pulls him off, or he would have killed this guy with a cane. I mean, these were men of a different breed.
Yes, they were.
And we've said this over and over again. You see the providential hand of God. They were men for their time.
Yes.
You could not put Andrew Jackson in the 1920s. You couldn't take these men and put them in other time periods. They wouldn't have worked.
You're right.
But man, he fit exactly the time that had to be there. It was a hard time in America.
And I wondered if he was religious, and I did some research, and he was.
He's a Presbyterian,
he was a
which you would like to be.
Yes. And he, I'm trying to think of...
His mom wanted to be a pastor, by the way. It was his mom's desire before she died, because he's 14 when she dies, because she's a nurse for the Revolutionary War, and she contracts cholera or something like that. But her desire, that's why he's one of the few literate brothers, is because she wants him to be a Presbyterian clergy. And he actually considers this for a while, and then figures out he doesn't have the temperament to be.
Oh, I imagine
a Presbyterian. Not. And he likes to drink and carouse and gamble, and he's like, I probably would be a very poor Presbyterian minister. So he decides. So yes, he is religious.
And which was, and in fact, I think I found a quote that that he said it as his final words when he passed away. It says, "God will take care of you for me. I am my God's. I belong to him. I go but a short time before you, and I want to meet you all in heaven, both white and black.
Yes.
What is the matter with my dear children? Have I alarmed you? Oh, do not cry. Be good children, and we will all meet in heaven."
Actually had that quote written down. I'm so glad you saw that. I love that. Do not cry. Be good, my dear children. We will meet in heaven.
So let's talk about that for a second, Caleb. Here we are. We're in the greatest republic form of government known to mankind that has sustained itself and really been thriving. I mean, we have if you look back at our warts and whatnot, yes, we've had issues. We've continued to have issues. But yet, we have these leaders, as we've talked about in our other podcasts, that come along at the right time, but they are marred as imperfect, as villains at times. And do we just stop and just say, well, we can never do this again, and well, we can learn from this to hopefully prevent this from happening again?
That's good.
But how do you study and understand the significance of somebody who could be so evil to others and yet so passionate about a nation. I mean,
I like that.
It's difficult, and we wrestle with this. We wrestle with this because we want it to be black or white. We want us to say we're all good. All Americans are good. No, all Americans are not good. Then all Americans are bad. No, they're not bad.
That's good. We were binary, and it's not binary.
No, it's never binary.
Yes.
And there's so much gray area out there for us that we have to keep. This is why I think faith is so important in the perpetuation of our nation, is that we all are subject to evil and sin and temptation, but yet there is something that drives us to a greater good. And I think that can be reflected in the expansion and development of our country, is that we've seen it evolve through all these. What was interesting is that his attorney general was Roger Taney. Roger Taney was the Supreme Court justice that the chief justice that gave the decision in the Dred Scott decision.
Really, I did not know that.
Yes, and who said that that African Americans will not and cannot be considered citizens of the United States. Wow. What a terrible! Of course, we know that now. We know that, but that was accepted back then by who was once an attorney general, then the chief justice of the Supreme Court. And yet, are we to say that America should have, dissolved back then because of this? I mean, it was bad. It was bad decisions. But when you put everything into context, the culture, the influences, the way life had been carried on for so long.
History's not written in a vacuum.
No,
it's
not
all
written in a
these
vacuum.
outside things that are playing into
it's why we need to have the discussion about
Absolutely.
it. Absolutely. People are saying, well, Donald Trump this, Donald Trump that. By golly, we talked about this. Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson might have come from the same mold.
They had a lot in common.
They did have a lot in common.
They had both an authority problem, right?
And humility did not enter into their personalities
nor
whatsoever.
did diplomacy.
No, nor did diplomacy. Their way or no way.
Yes.
And I'm not saying either is bad. Because of Andrew Jackson, we furthered the development of our nation. At a great cost to many lives. But yet,
as you look at. The Catholic histories used to do something when they would write on the saints. They'd write something called hagiographies, and it was the holy history of people. And what they would do is they'd look at a saint and they would remove all the flaws and all the bad things, and basically from the time they were a child onward, they were perfect. And we know hagiographies aren't real because people aren't perfect.
Correct.
And that's one thing that's interesting in American history is we don't have hagiographies of these men. We see their warts and all. But as we look at Scripture, as we look specifically at the Old Testament, God didn't record hagiographies either. As you look at Abraham and you look at Jacob and you look at these men of renown, they had a lot of problems.
Yes.
And God records their problems. And I think there's a reason why, because the whole entire Bible, and I'm getting my pastoral role here, is a book of redemption. And I think in many ways, as we look at America, it can be a nation of redemption. There are black marks, there are scars, there are problems, but there can be healing, there can be forgiveness. You talked about the idea of seeking goodness. I think that God put that in the heart of every human being, that they want to seek goodness, because we're creating the Imago Dei. We're created in the image of God, right? It's a marred image of God now, and only through the redemptive work of Jesus can we have the idea of actually reaching what God designed us to be.
Exactly.
And I think that's not only true for an individual, that's also true for a nation.
Yes. And again, I think the words that he says in his deathbed, crystallize that.
Yes.
And it doesn't necessarily justify his actions.
No.
But it makes the mind wonder, what was happening? How did it... did he know all along? Did he know that in order to further the interests of this nation, that we were going to have some difficult and very evil times? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
But
which we have to be careful. That's the end justifies the means argument,
exactly.
right?
And you don't ever want to do that.
No, because we're saying if we can basically harm enough now and it's good in the long run, is that okay? And that's the old philosophical question.
Right.
And we know from a biblical perspective, God says it's not only what you do, it's why you do it, and it's, how it affects others. So it is interesting. It's one of those things that's hard to grapple with.
Yes, it is.
And I think it's one thing that you and I talked about repeatedly before we even had this podcast, is that Jackson, he's a hard to understand guy. He's not a Washington where just, at 14 years old writing the book, The Rules of Civility.
Right,
and
learning all these different languages. And
wanting to follow his faith and just a man of principle and just a man of integrity and follow the rules of the court. And then Jackson, he's a maverick. He's a renegade.
And he appeals to a great number of Americans.
Which we still have that sector of Americans that still find that personality appealing.
Right.
Obviously, look at the polls today. So that's also something that parties are going to have to deal with, is that you have a large section of America that are attracted to the mavericks in politics.
Yeah. and you know, and they have their role.
Yes.
They have their role.
The debatable thing is, what is that role, right?
Yes, yes.
Therein lies the question, because is Commander-in-Chief the best role for that? And we don't know.
Yeah. But we're grateful to him. I
Yes.
mean, you know,
Jackson, as you said, he pushed forward the American expansion like few others before him did, and he was a great man. Was he a good man? That's a whole other story. As we kind of start to wrap this up, I love this quote. Later in life, as an old man, here's the quote. I think this defines Jackson's life. He said this: "I was born for the storm, and calm does not suit me well."
mm-hmm. And you know, when you think about that, how many people are those have those lives that were built to look good and as they sit in the harbor?
That's good.
But yet have never been out to sea to weather the rough weather. And he was just the opposite.
Yeah.
He was, I don't want to be in the harbor.
That's right.
I want to be out there where, and I mean, imagine at his age what he had seen, and then goes and leads this militia, especially in the Creek Wars, and then down in the Battle of New Orleans, and then comes down to Florida and takes on the Seminole Indians. I mean,
which is the only tribe that never signed a peace treaty.
You're right.
They're still revered by most native cultures. A lot of them called them the Water Walkers because they weren't going to surrender. They were the Andrew Jacksons of the Native Americans,
that's
right?
True.
And
Yes.
that's why I respect them and I love to study their history, because they were indomitable. They would not be conquered.
Yes.
And like you said, you kind of have two indomitable forces meeting them each other with Jackson and the Seminoles down here in Florida. It's brilliant military history, and it's fascinating reading.
When I was in the legislature, we had just commissioned paintings in the House of Representatives that went the history of the state of Florida, and then there is a painting there with Andrew Jackson and some of his soldiers as they're setting up the first capital in the state of Florida, and so his roots run pretty deep.
Yes.
In the state of Florida.
Yes, deep state Florida history. And one thing I love that you said, I just want to touch on this before we end, is you said how he wasn't built for the harbor. And I think that's really good. It's easy for us in an air-conditioned studio to sit around and criticize the actions of Jackson. But how many of us would actually have done what he did in battle, in fighting, in war, in the War of 1812, keeping the British from invading, all that he did, and that marked him. He was a war horse. And it's hard then to take a war horse and put him in an area of diplomatic politics. But had he been built for the civil diplomatic politics, he probably would have never been successful in the battlefield where we needed him.
That's true.
So I think it's easy, again, to criticize, and I don't want us to fall in that trap, because he did exactly what he had to do in a time when few people could do that.
Yeah.
How many men or women are built that type of breed, just that different, maybe a little different in the mind that you can actually do that?
That's true.
And he did it very successfully.
Yes, and is today part of our incredible legacy as the nation that we are.
The nation and the state, right?
And the
state
nation,
of Florida,
yes,
both.
yes.
So I think as we consider Andrew Jackson, he is an enigma. I do believe
you would love to hate him.
Yes, but you
know?
can't.
No, you can't.
I always tell my students this. We have this idea that people are like superheroes like Superman, or they're the Saturday morning cartoon villains sitting behind a desk thinking of how they're going to plot to take over the world. But that's not how these U.S. presidents were. They weren't all Superman, but they weren't like trying to figure out who they could just kill for the fun of it. They thought they were doing the right thing even when they did very wrong things. They were still thinking most of the time, how can I make America better, even when they made very bad choices in making what they thought was America better. Yeah. And I think that's important to realize. Like you said, you can't just blindly binary say, evil man, we're not going to look at him.
Right. And it still happens today. I mean, you know, in issues that we're facing as a nation. And
I mean, everyone wanted to remove him from the $20 bill. Was that actually signed? I don't know if that was. I think he
I don't think it was. Okay. I don't think it was.
So next time you pick up your 20, think about all of this history behind
Andrew Jackson. He didn't even want a national bank.
He was. It's ironic, isn't it?
It is very ironic.
Yeah.
But, and again, he was the people's man.
He was the people's man. And I think in closing, just that statement, I was born for the storm, and calm does not suit me well. This has been the life of Andrew Jackson.
Thank you.